Hi, I'm Rose. I'm an intern at Spineless Wonders, and I'm talking to Thomas Allen today, who's the author of Stumps and Smokes, two horror microfictions that we have just had on Little Fictions on Air this week. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, thank you. Thanks for having a chat.
It's all good. Bit nerve-wracking, but we'll be all right.
No need to be nervous. Just going to have a little convo. So I guess I'd start off with pretty basic question, but what is it that drew you to writing in the first place? How did you get into it?
Um, well, my story with writing is a bit silly. I think the first thing I ever wrote was Aragon, front to back. I just substituted the characters' names with mine and my best mates. I showed it to my dad, and he wasn't super impressed by it. But fair enough. No, I've always kind of just been writing. My grandma read to me a lot, and I really enjoyed reading stories, and she used to write stories with me. And yeah, I think family's been the big thing. They've always been really helpful and supportive and all that sort of stuff. And I don't know, I've just always been doing it.
So you've always known you wanted to pursue a career in writing?
Yeah, I think fairly early on, when you're in high school and they try and make you choose which way you want to go with the rest of your life. Writing was kind of always the end direction, wherein everything else was a decision to facilitate that. It still kind of is that sort of process at the moment. But yeah, I think fairly early on, after I decided that maybe paleontology wasn't as interesting, wasn't as fun as just pointing at dinosaurs all day. But yeah.
So do you find writing through school? Because a lot of people, say that they don't like creative writing in a school context. Did you always enjoy it?
Yeah. I remember we had an assignment in year 12 where it was take The Great Gatsby and write it in Fitzgerald style with a whole bunch of adverbs. Write it from a different character's point of view, and I think I kind of connected with that a bit better than a lot of my classmates. I kind of was already in the mindset to try that sort of stuff out. So yeah, I enjoyed it. It didn't really become such an intense passion until a bit after school. But it definitely was a thing I enjoyed dabbling with.
So is this the first time you've heard one of your stories performed?
This was the first time one of my stories had been published. So just to hear it read by anyone was fantastic. It was incredible, yeah.
Yeah, how does it feel to hear someone else interpreting your work?
Yeah, it's interesting because like the way I read those stories is not the way this fella reads them, but he just brings something else to him. He's just so much more life in it through his voice. Obviously, like I can understand where I'm coming from, and I have a lot of life through my own head, but he just brings something special to it, and I think it's that really seeing a reader bringing their own sort of personality to it. And
Yeah.
that's something you hear about a lot, but you don't, literally hear it through the audiobook sort of thing. So that was interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I didn't even think of it that way. Was there any specific part of the interpretation that maybe surprised you or?
Not particularly, just probably the pacing in the way it's read. So in my mind, I read it very differently, even though grammar should dictate where the stops and starts are. Just pauses go for a little bit longer, a little bit shorter in his reading compared to how I would read it. But it doesn't make it any worse or any better. It's just complete. I think it actually probably might make it better because it is, for me at least, seeing someone else's interpretation and seeing them, invest in it.
So as a writer, are you a particularly process-driven person? As you say, you've been writing from a really young age. So are there habits that have stuck with you from?
No, I'm sloppy as. I'm terrible. I mean, I found recently that the best thing I can do is go have a cup of coffee, maybe read a short story or something, and try and get a little bit of inspiration and get my head going. But it's like I'm busy, so it's just whenever I can, throw it in and just little pieces here and there, and it gets finished eventually.
What sort of thing do you like to read for inspiration?
Well, currently I'm reading Tim Winton, so like I've been reading him for a little while, but I've only kind of started to get into The Turning, his group of short stories, and I'm learning a lot from Tim, like a lot about the importance of plot and and all that sort of stuff. Besides Tim, I kind of just got off the back of reading a big fantasy series. So yeah, bit of everything. I read indiscriminately.
That's the only way to be, I think.
Yeah, but I think you got to read indiscriminately. Like you got to read a lot of different stuff, but you got to be able to like discriminate what's good and what's bad inside that stuff. You know, you can't just be a passive reader all the time. Especially like before I start writing, I like to look at it and I'm like, okay, that's why I like this. That's what that character was doing. That's why they're interesting to me. I think that's kind of the best way to get your own head in that sort of writing space.
Do you find yourself, analysing your own writing while you're working on a comparison with others?
I can't look at my own writing. I submitted to the Slinkies competition on a whim, and it was an exasperated whim. I don't want to look at these things anymore. I'm going to throw them in. They can be someone else's problem. If something happens, great. If nothing happens, at least I never have to look at them again. And I'm just so tired. I'm a really big critic on myself, and so it really helps trying to send that to other people, friends and family and all that sort of stuff to kind of calm me down. But I'm terrible.
I'm sure terrible is not the right word, but sometimes the chaotic kind of process works better for some people, Not everyone can put a whole plan down on paper. It doesn't work that way all the time.
If I try and my sort of process is I will go in with a bit of a plan, but it very often ends up looking completely different to how I went in. So yeah. Just a process that you've got to force yourself through.
Yeah.
But you love it. You love every moment.
So did that happen at all with these two stories? Were they quite different before you started?
So Smokes was supposed to be this weird sort of funeral setting wherein it was Butterfly Eyes' a sort of funeral, and there's all these old fellas kind of coming back and all these old ladies coming in and remembering that, this was the spot where like we all kind of grew up and we all became people. We all like had all that frustration, but there's no funeral in that story now. That's completely gone. It just disappeared. Stumps, I think, was fairly straightforward. I didn't mess with that too much. I probably gave it a little bit more meat than I originally planned to, in the sense of the happenings that kind of occur when the house starts having strange things happen to it. So I probably only had a very short, small sort of paragraph explaining that until I kind of talked to a few people and we went into it and fleshed it out more and made it a bit more tense. So, yeah.
So it's very much like a horror kind of set of stories, these two. Are you a big horror fan? Do you usually write horror? The first time I thought these stories were horror was when Spineless Wonders kind of came to me and they're like, oh yeah, they're horror stories. So I was like, okay, I suppose that's right. I've never considered them to be horror stories. Right.
I kind of considered them to be coming of age, which are just a bit harsher than your usual story. Like I set out to write Stumps as having read very little Australian fiction and having been under the idea that Australian fiction was, gum trees and koalas. Like it's just bush fiction. There's nothing more to Australian fiction. So I was like, that's it. I'm going to write an Australian short story. That's nothing to do with any of that. And I mean, now I'm reading all these other fantastic writers, and that's not Australian fiction at all. But yeah, it was never like a goal to write a horror story by any stretch. And I don't particularly read a lot of horror. I've just started reading a little bit of Stephen King, but yeah, it's been interesting. It's made me think maybe that's a potential avenue that I should be focusing on. Like, what would happen if I set out to write a horror story?
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's been rolling around in the back of my mind recently.
Oh, well, do you think you will? Do you think you'll go for it?
Yeah, maybe. I got some other stuff I got to finish first. It's kind of I like to do. I think who is it? I think it's Jordan Peele in his writing process, and he just says, "Follow the fun. Just whatever you're enjoying the most, just keep doing that. Otherwise, you'll start resenting whatever else it is you're working on." So yeah, try and just do whatever I'm enjoying, whatever's ahead of me, and just keep following that rabbit hole and see where it goes.
Right. So, I mean, you've said before in one of your previous interviews with Spineless Wonders that Tenbi, the town of Tempe, is full of all the urban legends from your childhood, from your
Yeah.
childhood, and that you're really influenced by adolescence and coming of age. Can you talk a bit about that, like how that influences these stories?
I mean, I remember when I grew up, there was some rough kids who kind of lived across the road. I used to hang out with them, and then around the side of my neighbour's house, it kind of disappeared into bush. So you'd hang out with these rough kids, you end up in the bush, and these rough kids were a bit older than I was, so they were feeding me a whole bunch of lies, just trying to scare me a little bit. And so they came up with all those classic sort of ones like, oh yeah, there's a panther living in the woods up here, or there's that person over there in that house, no one goes in there. They're a bit of a murdery sort of person, and like you just remember all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I still have memories of getting lost in those forests and having a small panic attack, and then you realize like as an adult that forest is 100 meters deep and there's no way you could have got lost ever before, but as a kid you could. So yeah.
Yeah. Do you usually write microfictions, or are you more leaning towards long form fiction?
I've so I started just writing novels. So obviously I started with my Aragon novel, but after that I remember I worked on another fantasy, which I think I wrote it and never it wasn't structured writing at all. It was word vomit, and it ended up being some ridiculous amount of words. That would be 4 or 5 books, and none of it was any good. And then I kind of honed myself, kind of pulled myself back in and started thinking about what writing was and how I should approach it and what I wanted to do with writing. And so then I wrote a few long form things, kind of dissipated towards the end. So I kind of come from long form, and it was an active sort of decision to try and write short fiction. So I wrote Stumps, and then I wrote Smokes, and then I wrote a short story called Dogs, which was picked up almost around the exact same time for the Queensland Young Writers Award. So I got that came out of that, and since then I've been busy and haven't managed to put anything else out.
Well, it does happen that way sometimes. So do you find it more challenging to write in short form? Is there more constraint, or do you find it harder?
I think it is challenging. It's just trying to limit yourself and try and hit the highlights without, because I like to disappear down rabbit holes and just explore things that have no relation to anything. But I think short forms really taught me that the importance of plot and the importance of ideas and motifs throughout the work, and kind of having an objective and making sure everything serves that objective. So it's fine to write a story, especially a long form story, but if there's no purpose, even if it's just like an enjoyment or to connect with the character or whatever, but if you've just written it because you like a certain idea, like a certain sort of set piece moment that has no substance behind it, it's not going to connect with anyone. It's not going to have any attachment. And so I think this is the idea that I've learned in the back end now, and something I kind of came to learn through the writing of Stumps and then Smokes and then Dogs. And I think if you look at them in that order, you can definitely see there is growth, especially in how a story is told and how plot matters and how style influences and all that sort of stuff. I think the last year has been very formative for me.
In what regard would you say?
In just going from writing without necessarily forethought or without reason. So just if you care about something, you care about communicating an idea or a feeling or an atmosphere, that writing has much more weight and much more substance behind it than just sort of word vomiting cool little moments, I think.
So do you think you, like you said, you can see the progression in your style through those 3 stories? Do you ever go back and read old writing and compare it now?
Yeah, or not all the time, but I do it semi-regularly, and it makes you feel better about myself, for sure. But it also, there's a lot of cringe back in the old days.
So back to Stumps and Smokes, the town of Tenbi, Is
Mm-hmm.
is that drawn from your own growing up, or is
Um, so I so I grew up on the Gold Coast, so it's kind of like a city without a CBD. It's kind of a big stretched out, sprawling mess. But I was born in Geelong, and I used to travel down there fairly often. And I really, really like Geelong. I like that it's cold because the Gold Coast was never cold. Geelong was cold. It had all small fences. It was all very, everything felt local and connected when I was down there. And then I recently spent some time in Toowoomba, which is kind of up in the mountains. And I've since all this has started publishing and stuff, I've moved to Toowoomba. But Toowoomba's really nice, the same sort of sense. Everything's a bit slower, a bit quieter. Everything's more connected, and it's just yeah. I think it definitely is this Tempe's this weird combination of small town sort of mythos mixed with what is Toowoomba and Geelong in my mind.
so in Smokes, sorry, not Smokes, in Stumps, you said before that they weren't initially in your mind, they weren't horror stories, but there's quite a supernatural element in Stumps. Is that
Mm-hmm.
in your mind before it was suggested that it was a horror? Was that quite a metaphorical element?
Well, the way I tried to write Stumps is that it kind of remains ambiguous as to whether it is supernatural or whether it's some of the kids trying to get a bit of retribution on the family.
Mm.
And so I kind of left that opening somewhat ambiguous. I mean, yeah, I suppose it never appeared to me as if it was horror because it always walked that line between is it real or is it not real.
Mm.
It was definitely like thriller sort of thing, but because it had this sort of local community based atmosphere and these kids who obviously wanted to get some sort of revenge on the Zoss family, it kind of it just never occurred to me that that would be horror.
Interesting. Well, I mean, Smokes has quite a lot of ambiguity in it as well. It's quite mysterious in the way that it's told. Do you go for that quite a lot stylistically? Historically, is that your kind of go-to, keeping things quite ambiguous, or?
I think yeah, I wanted to create a layer of mystery over the whole city of Tenby. I wanted there to be a lot of urban legends, and I want the audience to kind of sit there and not know which ones to believe in. Because I don't think anyone comes into a story reading about urban myths and believes all of them.
Mm.
But like, I think it's an interesting idea that maybe some of them are true, or maybe some of them are true or maybe they're half truths. Like, yes, these things happen, but they're not necessarily a ghost. They're just a bunch of kids messing around, sort of thing. So yeah.
So is there anything else coming from Tenby? Is there more to the series, or?
Yeah, so Tempe kind of is the short stories I've been working on, and they kind of got some traction, and I was enjoying writing this new sort of coming of age / thriller sort of atmosphere. So at the moment, I'm working on one that's very heavily based in AFL and in football, and just because I grew up reading all that sort of stuff, Specky McGee and all that, and I wanted to try and do my own sort of take on it and kind of approach it in a different sense.
Yeah, cool. So, taking a slight detour here, how has it been for you being a part of the Slinkies? I mean, you said you didn't expect to necessarily be a part of it. It was kind of, a bit of a whim. So how has that impacted you, do you think?
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Like, it's given me a lot of confidence in my writing, obviously. Having never been published before, and then getting picked up for both stories, not even just one or the other. I got picked up for both, and then writing on the back of that, getting that Queensland runners-up award and all that sort of stuff. It's just been a whirlwind couple of months that have been fantastic. And then I've had exams for uni, and I feel like I've stalled a little bit, so I need to get back on the horse and keep writing.
Mm.
But yeah, it was definitely incredibly rewarding, and it's been a really, really interesting process going through, just seeing the back end of submitting to a competition and the support that Spineless Wonders are putting into it. Like, I thought this was going to be a couple of short stories, see if they get through, but now it's turned into what's this? My second interview. It's turned into 2 audio readings. It's been pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. How important, sorry, do you feel it is to get that kind of exposure as a young writer, not just for the obvious exposure for your stories, but for your confidence and for your feeling of moving forward?
Definitely, it's so important. I think there was, before a week before I got the phone call saying, "Hey, we'd like to publish your stuff." I was thinking, I was like, this writing thing, it's not going anywhere. I'm missing out on doing some other stuff. Maybe I should look elsewhere and invest myself in some other hobbies or some other interests or something like that. But I was saying that to myself. I knew I was going to keep writing. Like, you don't just stop writing. But yeah, it's definitely reinforced the confidence in myself. And that's not that's the thing a lot of people lack just in everyday life, not even looking at writing. Just people lack a lot of confidence in themselves and who they are and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's been incredibly rewarding and yeah, super handy. Super thankful for it.
So, what's next for you on the writing horizon then? I know you said you're really busy at the moment, but any big projects on the...
So I'll finish up my uni, which has only got 2 weeks left in it, and then I'm going to finish up the short story I was working on, which is that AFL one. I'll finish that short story up and then see where I want to go from there. So I've got a couple of different avenues I could go down. I could begin working back on long form, or I could do a couple more short form because I'm kind of in that space and I'm experimenting with plot and style. And I think I probably will end up doing more short fiction, if only to sort of explore my own writing a little bit more.
Yeah, cool. So I guess gotta ask, end of the interview, kind of any advice for our aspiring author viewers and any other aspiring authors out there?
I'm still on that boat, but I would say that it's what I said earlier is read discriminately. Like, have a look at the books you love and think about why you love them. Like, why is this character more interesting than all the other characters? Why is this idea repeated a few times? Like, what does that achieve? And if you just, it takes 5 minutes. And most of the time when you finish a book, you're like, oh, that was fantastic. And you have to take a moment to try and think about this like underlying emotion you've got. So just use that time and have a think, especially if you're a writer, have a think about what mattered to you and what you would like to incorporate in your own writing.
It's really good advice. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I think that's about all we got time for at the moment, but thanks for having a chat. Is there anything
Yeah, no worries. Thanks.